1862. The Civil War is about to take an unexpected turn as death tolls mount and both army and civilian onlookers are shocked. This year, Lincoln will release his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, changing the nature of the war. And the fledgling Seventh-day Adventist Church will continue to organize and begin asking further, deeper questions about their theology of war and how their young men should be involved.
I think it's fair to say that the founders of our church, Joseph Bates, Ellen White, James White, were fierce abolitionists. Joseph Bates was known to have belonged to a number of societies and movements that supported the abolition of slavery.
Rochester was a stopping point for the Underground Railroad, and so was Battle Creek. And several of the founders of the Adventist Church ran Underground Railroad stations.
Even John Byington, the first president of the General Conference, is involved in the abolitionist movement, and at one point in his experience serves as a stopping point for Southern slaves who were trying to make it to Canada because of the fugitive slave law. And there are a number of Adventists who become involved in civil disobedience over this issue of slaves not being forced to go back to the South and to slavery.
As the new year dawns, Ellen White writes about a new vision regarding the war. She points out that there is confusion not only among soldiers enlisted in the Union armies and citizens at home, but also among leaders and politicians as to the true meaning and purpose of the Civil War. Some have been fighting for union of the nation, others for the abolition of slavery. Abraham Lincoln has been clear and consistent in his statements about the constitutional and other limits upon the United States government in regard to slavery. He is sworn by office to preserve the Union. However, he has also been working toward some legal form of emancipation. At first, he seeks a gradual voluntary emancipation through Congress and the border states. But now, by spring of 1862, Lincoln is privately writing ideas for what will become the Emancipation Proclamation. Both North and South call for public days of prayer and fasting to seek God's blessing on their respective causes. After her new vision, Ellen White speaks out.
It is this accursed system of slavery, and this alone, which lies at the foundation of the war. As this war was shown to me, it looked like the most singular and uncertain that has ever occurred. Some fully believe that the result of the war will be to abolish slavery. Others intend to be very careful to keep slavery just as it is, but to put down the rebellion and preserve the Union. I saw that these national fasts were an insult to Jehovah. Saith the Lord, is not this the fast I have chosen, to let the oppressed go free? When our nation observes the fast which God has chosen, then will he accept prayers as far as the war is concerned. But now they enter not into his ear. He turns from them. They are disgusting to him.
Ellen White had no use for slavery. For her, every human being is created in the image of God. James White made this interesting statement. He referred to the South's rebellion as the most hellish rebellion since Satan and his angels. So they had no respect for the South and its engagement in slavery.
What I admired about them is that their willingness to speak to the large national issues of their days. It seems as if they have the moral courage to speak to the evils of the nation. But they did it in a way that was not disrespectful. They consider themselves patriotic, true Americans.
Seventh-day Adventists, though patriotic, are generally abolitionists at heart, and so, like many other Christian abolitionists, find it difficult to support the calls for fasting and prayer until a firm national stance is taken for emancipation.
I would define the abolitionist movement as a quasi-religious movement that runs across the denomination. Adventists aren't going to be the only ones talking about abolition and freeing the slaves. This is going to run the gamut.
The pages of the review reflect the abolitionist sentiment, even republishing articles that appear in other publications, including a 14-issue serial of The Bible, No Refuge for Slavery, and reprinted columns written by the woman who had sparked national debate with Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Fathers and mothers of this country, God loves the poor, despised African as you love those sons whose sufferings you mourn. The sons of the lonely slave mother, torn from her to die in Carolina rice swamps, are precious in her eyes as your sons that died in the trenches. How long must this people wait? The time has come when the nation has a right to demand, and the President of the United States a right to decree their freedom. How many plagues must come on us before we will hear the evident voice, "Let this people go"? Must we wait for the 10th and last? Must we wait till there be not a house where there is not one dead? Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Across the country, death visits tens of thousands of families as husbands, sons, and brothers die through disease and bloody battle. Even in Washington City, the Lincoln family cannot escape. In February, 11-year-old Willie Lincoln falls ill with typhoid fever. He suffers for weeks with pain and periods of mental wandering and delirium. Abraham and Mary Lincoln sit for hours at their son's bedside, but he finally succumbs, lungs filling with fluid, and mercifully carried off by pneumonia, he dies about 5:30 p.m. on February 20. Elizabeth Keckley, a former slave who is now Mary Lincoln's seamstress, recalls,
"I assisted in washing him and dressing him, and then laid him on the bed when Mr. Lincoln came in. I never saw a man so bowed down with grief. Great sobs choked his utterance. He buried his head in his hands, and his tall frame was convulsed with emotion. I shall never forget those solemn moments. Genius and greatness weeping over love's idol lost."
The Lincolns, the Loughboroughs, the Whites, and countless other families live in an era of extremely high childhood mortality. But the Civil War heaps even more death upon death, and still it continues. The Battle of Shiloh marks a new low point for the war. Vast numbers of casualties shock both the Confederate and Union troops and horrify civilians on the home front. By the end of the 3-day battle, almost 24,000 men are dead, wounded, or missing.
I saw 5 dead Confederates, all killed by one 6-pound solid shot, no doubt from one of our cannon. They had been behind a log and all in a row. The ball had raked them as they crouched behind the log, no doubt firing at our men. One of them had his head taken off. One had been struck at the right shoulder and his chest lay open. One had been cut in two at the bowels, and nothing held the carcass together but the spine. One had been hit at the thighs, and the legs were torn from the body. The fifth and last one was piled up into a mass of skull, arms, some toes, and the remains of a butternut suit. Ambulances and men are hurrying over the field and gathering up the wounded. The surgeons are cutting off the arms and legs. Details are out burying the dead this evening. The terrible rain of last night has filled the ground with water. The trees are just bursting into leaf, and the little flowers are covering the ground, but their fragrance is lost in the pall of death which has settled down on this bloody field. This is the valley and the shadow of death. Cyrus F. Boyd, 15th Iowa Infantry.
Politically and strategically, Confederate President Jefferson Davis needs to make a change. In June, he asks Robert E. Lee to take command of the Army of Northern Virginia. In Washington, Abraham Lincoln now approaches his cabinet with a document that he hopes will emancipate Southern slaves. Secretary of State Seward suggests that Lincoln should not make this move until the North gains a military victory, so it does not appear as a desperate act. Lincoln agrees, but informs his cabinet that he has made a promise to his maker that he will issue this Emancipation Proclamation. Now he simply waits for the right time and a military victory. In August, James White publishes a controversial article in the Review and Herald entitled "The Nation."
For the past 10 years, the Review has taught that the United States of America were a subject of prophecy, and that slavery is pointed out in the prophetic word as the darkest and most damning sin upon this nation. The anti-slavery teachings of our publications have been such that their circulation has been forbidden in the slave states. For many reasons, our people have not taken that part in the present struggle that others have.
What should Seventh-day Adventist support be for the Union cause? A flurry of articles sparked by James White's column discuss the issue. Questions of bearing arms, service to country, and the morality of war are hotly debated among the Adventists. But the war is not just a set of theoretical questions. It is also a practical distraction and disruption from what Seventh-day Adventists see as their true mission, the preaching and spreading of God's Word.
Truth must be proclaimed, and the troubles in our own nation are beginning seriously to embarrass the proclamation of the message. The Illinois tent is laid up for the rest of the season. It is useless to pitch the tent in new fields while the war excitement lasts. We have learned from Brethren Waggoner and Snook that the state of Iowa is put under martial law and that they were detained under military arrest till they procured a certificate from the county judge setting forth their place of residence, their present occupation, and calling. The judge advised them to immediately repair to their homes, as they would be daily more and more liable to troubles and difficulties. And now Brother M.E. Cornell writes from New York, "The war excitement was so great we had to adjourn for 2 nights. Our tent was used for the war meetings. I never saw such an excitement as there is here in Rochester. The streets are blocked up with the tents of recruiting officers. The stores are all closed from 3 to 6 p.m., and all are trying to induce men to enlist. War meetings every night. The rich men fear the draft, and they offer up as high as $315 to induce men to go. Men's hearts are troubled."
The war hits close to home for James and Ellen White. Near their house in Battle Creek, a field is turned into a military parade ground where troops marshal before heading to the front.
And the White boys and then the Lewis boys lived down in the corner, and I'm sure others, if they were here, went up and watched them. And while they were watching them, Henry could whistle the cadence. He learned how to whistle the cadence. And they also made a drum, and they'd beat the daylights out of it. They made bow and arrows, and they played war and had all kinds of wonderful things that they did. And Sister White and James were concerned because Henry was losing his first love for the Lord. He was more interested in what was going on up there, and he was almost to the age where he could volunteer.
Even as the war touches Adventists directly, Confederate troops under the new command of Robert E. Lee push northward. A devastating battle occurs yet again at Bull Run, and the Army of Northern Virginia is able to push further into Maryland. On September 17, 1862, the Union and Confederate armies meet at Antietam Creek, near Sharpsburg, Maryland. The battle ends by 5:30, with over 23,000 dead, wounded, and missing. Over 25% of the entire Federal force and over 30% of the Confederate are lost. More Americans die in the Battle of Antietam than on any other single day in history.
Abraham Lincoln needs to claim a victory at Antietam. He has the Emancipation Proclamation sitting in his pocket that he's waiting to release. And the United States cannot release the Emancipation Proclamation until it does so from a position of strength, so it doesn't look like it's an act of desperation. The Emancipation Proclamation changes the nature of the war, changes the very nature of the American Civil War. And it goes from a war of union to a war against slavery.
So the abolitionists would then were more inclined to say, it is now a holy crusade. And they, in the newspapers, in personal letters and diaries, you see this language, the crusade language coming out. That changes the attitude. The revivalists could then take on. Both the language of revivalism and crusading could then be used honestly. And then there's a greater passion in the North to end this fighting.
Once Abraham Lincoln publicly issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, Adventists are finally able to throw their support behind the Union more fully, citing the just and moral cause for war. J.N. Loughborough is particularly supportive. Though more supportive of the war effort, the Adventists still wrestle with questions. Should Seventh-day Adventists draw arms upon another human being created in the image of God? They begin developing a theology of conscientious objection, which will be tested in the coming years of war. As Adventists deal with civil war in their own country, they also begin looking beyond the borders of America to share their faith. As their message slowly begins to spread around the globe, news from abroad is reported in the Review.
Brother Campbell is keeping the Sabbath. He is a widower and has 3 children. The oldest, a boy of 9 years, was convinced at once and asked his papa what day Jesus Christ kept. On being told he kept the 7th, or the one called Saturday, he said, "Well, Papa, that is the one we should keep." Now Brother Campbell is preaching our doctrine as far as he has got the light. There is a good deal of excitement in this country now about our doctrine. I hope Brother White has got my last letter, in which I made a request for a messenger. I trust some will see it their duty to respond to my call. Jane Martin, Tullivin, Coot Hill, Cavan County, Ireland.
While the Adventist message finds a home in Ireland, over 1.5 million Irish immigrants find their new home in America after the potato famine of the 1840s and 50s.
This is the nativist period. There's a strong feeling that foreigners are not good for our country. And foreigners who, as the Irish are lower class, are Roman Catholic, in a largely Protestant milieu are often the blue-collar, lowest of the low job workers. They do the dirty work that no one else will do. The Erie Canal at this time, 1817 to 1825, was finished by the Irish. The railroads that were being put through the Northeast and Midwest, 1850s, 1860s, built by the Irish.
And during the Civil War, the Irish fight. Despite believing their already tenuous position in American society is threatened by cheap black labor which might be brought in by abolitionism, over 150,000 Irish Americans fight for the Union cause. In August and September, the nation's attention is captured by a startling event on the great western plains of the United States. After treaty violations by U.S. Indian agents inflict hardship and hunger on the very tribes they are meant to protect, several bands of Eastern Sioux begin attacking settlers in southwest Minnesota. The public finds the violence particularly shocking, with eyewitness reports of murder, gang rape, mutilation, and gratuitous brutality. National interest is so widespread, even the Review and Herald carries several items on the conflict.
To the best of our knowledge, none of our brethren have been killed in the late uprising, though some have fled from their homes, leaving their crops, herds, and household effects subject to destruction. We have hitherto felt secure from the immediate horrors of the Southern Rebellion, but we now find that we are not. We are but 20 miles from a band numbering 1,800 to 2,000. We have lately visited their reservation and believe there is no danger from them, as they have but few arms and are entirely friendly. Our trust and hope is fixed in God. We feel assured that He cares for us and is mighty and able to save in this our time of extreme distress. F.W. Morse, Deerfield, Minnesota, August 29th, 1862.
The great majority of the Dakota bands in Minnesota are not involved in the uprising, but the public paints all the Sioux with the same brush. The issue becomes so great that the president is himself drawn into the picture. By early December, 303 Sioux prisoners are convicted of murder and rape by military tribunals and sentenced to death. Despite pressure to hang all 303, President Abraham Lincoln personally reviews the records and commutes the death sentences of nearly all the condemned. In the end, only 38 are hanged. Despite Lincoln's clemency, this is still the largest mass execution in American history. Clouded with national crisis and rising death counts, the Christmas season of 1862 is dark and dismal. Abraham Lincoln tells a friend,
"If there is a place worse than hell, I am in it."